This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, everybody. So we'll get started now. I think there will be some people coming in still in dribs and drabs. There will be a recording of this event if you do come in late, so which those people won't hear, but there will be a recording available so people can catch up on any bits that they've missed. So yes, welcome to this No Knives, Better Lives webinar on preventing corrosive substance violence. My name is Emily and I work on the No Knives, Better Lives team. For those of us who are new to our work, we work in partnership with young people and practitioners to understand and address the drivers of youth violence in Scotland. One of the primary roles that we have is keeping practitioners up to date with policy, research, and best practice. So today we're discussing corrosive substance or acid violence and how to prevent it, because there's been a new change in legislation here in Scotland and across the UK. The Offensive Weapons Act 2019 came into force this year and includes new measures to control the sale of corrosive products and introduces new offences related to their possession and use. We're going to hear from Dr. Matt Hopkins, Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Leicester, and Shah, Executive Director of Acid Survivors Trust International. We're going to hear from both speakers and then take questions from the audience before closing with a discussion on prevention. I'd encourage you to add your questions to the speakers into the Q&A function throughout the event, and of course, any comments on the chat. You can add your comments anonymously as well, and also others, panelists, you're allowed to answer questions as they're going, but I suggest we keep them all for the bulk questions session. Just want to say that we're obviously talking about a difficult topic today, so please do step away, take a moment if you need. Like I said, there'll be a recording available after the event to catch up if you miss anything. So first up, we're going to hear from Matt, and he's going to be talking all about motivations and a kind of profile of those who use and carry corrosive substances. Matt's work at the University of Leicester spans a variety of areas in relation to crime prevention, commercial victimization and organised crime. And in February 2021, Matt co-authored a report for the Home Office on those motivations of offenders who carry and use acid and other corrosives in criminal attacks. I'm just going to get your slides up, Matt. Oh, 2 seconds. Sorry. Over to you, Matt.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Emily. I can't actually see my slides at the moment. Are they? Can the attendees see the slides? Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Emily, and thanks for that introduction. So I am an associate professor from the University of Leicester, and I've worked across many areas in relation to crime prevention and criminal justice for a number of years. First, I'd like to say many thanks to Emily for inviting us to speak today. I think the work that you do is not only really timely, but it's really important as well. And I think there is a lot of interest around the use of weapons in crime, particularly obviously knives at the moment, where there's been a lot of interest for a number of years now. But one of the areas which interests me is the use of corrosive substances in crime events. And I think this is an area which probably tends to get pushed to one side a little bit because of the focus on knife crime, really. But this is an important area. And I think this is something, even though the numbers of acid attacks or corrosive substance crimes are it's obviously nowhere near as high as the number of possession and use of knives that we have. It's something which I don't think is going to go away in the United Kingdom. So I think it's an area we need to keep an eye on and have some focus on. So next slide, please, Emily. What I'm going to be talking about today is largely around a bit of work that I did with a couple of academics from the University of Leicester, which looked at the motivations for the use of corrosive substances in crime. So as I say, it was commissioned by the Home Office, and it was really largely interested in the spike in acid attacks, which we saw particularly in London around that 2016-2017 period. So what I'm going to talk about largely today, I'll talk about kind of definitions and patterns of acid crime. I'll talk a little bit around motivations for carrying and motivations for using. I'm probably going to focus quite a bit around motivations for carrying and using. And they are split up for good reasons, thinking about carrying and using. But those are the two areas really where, when we did our research, there was practically no research at all which looked at the motivations for carrying and using corrosive substances in crime. The literature which was available was largely from so-called developing countries, and I hate that expression, but it focused around countries where there tended to be reports of acid attacks, so countries such as Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. And a lot of that work focused around the use of acid in domestic cases, so tended to be men against women, quite often for where women had turned down the sort of love advances of men and stuff like that. And what those reports tended to do was really focus on medical records. And there'd been no contact at all, or no efforts at all to talk to people who'd actually committed acid attacks. So what our research tried to do was to identify motivations, but we tried to engage with people who we knew because they'd been convicted of crimes which had involved acid. So our research was largely around doing interviews with those people. I'll also talk a little bit about prevention as well, and I'll kind of sketch over that in this presentation because I think that might be a useful source of discussion actually at the end of this session, to think about prevention and really where prevention needs to go. So next slide, please, Emily. Just to be clear on what we're talking about here, acid violence has been defined in a number of ways, but it's quite interesting when we talk about acid attacks, how often, particularly in the media, that they're wrongly interpreted. Okay, so you know, I've got a definition of what acid violence involves here. So intentional acts of violence in which perpetrators throw, spray, or pour acid onto victims' faces or bodies. Though if you look at the work of Watson, who's done some excellent historical work on acid violence, she talks about acid violence as the use of acid, throwing, corrosive crime, noxious substance attacks, vitriol attacks, vitriolage, burns violence, and chemical attacks. So the point I want to make here is I think we have to be careful when we talk about acid violence, because what acid violence quite often involves is the use of a range of corrosive substances. And we certainly found that in our research. And it ranged from the use of household bleach to sulfuric acid. And I think this does have implications for how we think about prevention eventually, actually, because a lot of the preventative work is focused around high concentrate substances, where actually when we look at patterns of acid attacks or corrosive substance crime and the types of substances which are used, they do actually range from lots of products which are just available on shelves to those which are more concentrate and harder to get hold of. So to give a bit of context around patterns here, next slide, please. If we look at weapons trends, and this is England and Wales data, we have seen a definite increase in the use of offenders using knives since 2015 in particular, and this is where obviously a lot of attention has focused. if we look at firearms trends have certainly come down in England and Wales, and we've seen a kind of tailing off in the use of firearms over the same period of time. So certainly since 2015, we've seen a decline in the use of firearms. Now, I think this probably says something about weapons contagion effects. I think a lot of offenders who we've had contact with certainly tend to have different attitudes towards knives and guns. I don't think we tend to have the culture of gun use in the UK, which maybe we have in certain other countries. And I think as well, gun controls actually in the UK have been reasonably effective. And there's certainly evidence which points to that. We certainly do have in some sections of our society a culture of knife use. And I think there are various reasons for this. If we just switch on to the next slide and think about acid violence. So what do we know about the patterns here of acid violence? Well, we certainly know that we saw a spike in acid attacks in London, as the chart shows there in 2016. But the way this was portrayed very much in the media was almost as if this was something which was new. Certain sections of the media was talking about, you know, the moral kind of disintegration of society and all this sort of stuff. Though we do know, obviously, that acid attacks historically have occurred in Britain, and again, the work of Watson here points to that. We saw vitriol attacks in Victorian Britain. We also saw in London as well in the mid-1980s. There was again a spike in acid attacks there, where we saw 500 attacks in 1987, and we see this peak in 2016, 2017 in London. So we know that in Britain we do have a history of acid violence, and the evidence seems to point that these trends are cyclical. So they probably go away for a bit and then they come back again. And if you look at Crime Survey for England and Wales data, there were 525 corrosive substance attacks for the year ending March 2022. So, you know, we're kind of hovering around 500-600 attacks a year in England and Wales that we know about. And I know Jaff probably will kind of contest this data a little bit. I think we both would contest this data actually. But one of the problems is with acid violence, it's very hard to get accurate figures on this, is a key message here. Next slide, please. So let's just think about the picture in Scotland a little bit, okay? So you know, I've said very little about Scotland so far. So again, historically, you know, we know that acid attacks have occurred in Scotland. One of the problems here is there's a relative paucity of data, okay? But we know there's been gangland attacks involving acid. And we know, you know, when you look at the Hugh Kennedy case in 1834, he was hanged for the use of acid in an attack on a fellow servant. Historically, there have been attacks in Scotland. Also, as well, if you look at the work of Russell Findlay, a journalist who investigated lots of organised crime in Scotland, he was attacked by William Burns in 2015. He was an organised criminal. He was going after Russell Findlay because of the investigative work that Russell Findlay was doing. So, you know, we do see these attacks in Scotland. It's not something which is foreign to Scotland, but again, there's a relative paucity of good data on numbers of attacks here that we see. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to say now, I'm going to say a little bit about the characteristics of UK acid attacks, and I'll talk about motivations. So what do we know about UK acid attacks? Well, we know generally UK acid attacks, we think, differ from the sorts of attacks which are widely reported in countries such as Bangladesh and India. We tend to have a concentration of male-on-male attacks in corrosive substance crime here. So offenders tend to be young males and survivors tend to be young males as well. The data which we analysed, which was based on over 600 police case file records on corrosive substance crime, only identified that around 10% of attacks were criminal gangs involved in those attacks. But we think that is a vast under-recording effect there, because the police quite often just don't know what the background is to to offenders and survivors in such attacks. So that figure, that 10% there, is grossly underestimated. We do know that a range of substances are used, so it's not only serious high concentrate sort of substances. However, what we also know as well, which I think again reveals quite a lot about potential preventative opportunities, is that we had a concentration in London and the Northeast in our research, but those concentrations were really in areas where there are indices of multiple deprivation, areas 1 and 2. So we see concentrations of attacks in areas of highest deprivation. And what I wouldn't want to do is create a simple causal link between deprivation and the use of acid violence. But I think there's something to be explored there around why it is we see those concentrations in areas of multiple deprivation. Next slide, please, Emily. So what our research did, so we analysed data from nearly 700 police records, and we also did face-to-face interviews with 25 people who were in prison and they'd been convicted for the use of a corrosive substance in a crime. And what we identified was that certain carrier groups seemed to emerge from our research. So you get a group of people who were referred to as regular carriers, and those were people who were often multiple weapons users. So these were people who they would regularly carry a corrosive substance, and they would regularly carry a knife as well at the same time. We did have a group of people who were referred to as special occasions only, specialists, who would only ever carry and use a corrosive substance for one particular crime event. So this might be a revenge attack on somebody who owed them money, or where there'd been a drugs-related crime, or for a robbery. We also saw people who carried corrosive substances, which actually weren't for the purpose of criminal events, really. They were carrying them quite often as part of sort of paraphernalia, particularly drugs use. So people would use ammonia for use of crack cocaine, and the use of the carrying of ammonia there would also double up as a weapon potentially at times. So you could use it for drugs use, but also if necessary, you could use it if you were attacked as well. We also saw people who we referred to as heat of the moment carriers. So these are people who maybe were involved in a street fight where somebody actually passed the substance to them during a fight, and then they used the substance at that time. So we referred to them as receivers. They weren't kind of carrying all the time, but they received in the heat of the moment. And then we saw a group who were referred to as novices, where the use of their acid was situationally determined. And these were people who were primarily involved in domestic attacks. So they would be at home, they would get into an argument with their partner or whoever, or something like that would occur. They would grab a corrosive substance and they would use it. So these people were quite commonly using sort of household cleaning products like bleach. Next slide, please, Emily. So the question here comes up, particularly with people who are regular carriers of corrosives. Why are they carrying corrosives? And what we found here was actually the main reasons around this tend to be availability. So corrosives are readily available, and they're particularly readily available to the criminal fraternity who want to get hold of high concentrate fluids if they need to, but also as well substances which are particularly useful in crimes such as robbery, like cleaning products which are ammonia based, are readily available, so easy to get hold of. We also found as well there's a sort of perception of risk around the possession of corrosives, where a lot of offenders tend to think actually the risks for getting caught with corrosives are lower than what they are for knives. And one of the important things about corrosives as well in carrying it is this idea of disguise and blending in. So lots of offenders talk about being able to blend in with corrosives. One of the things that we found was that the carrying vessels for corrosives are quite often water bottles, and Lucozade sports bottles as well are very common. So it's easy to blend in when you can use those sort of carrying utensils. Next slide, please. So in terms of carrying, what we did find was that there are cycles of protection here for offenders, where we found that quite often the people we spoke to were worried about being victimized, were worried about being attacked. So they tended to acquire a weapon of some type. The idea that they need to protect themselves. But then this creates a situation, number 3 here, where there's a perception that everybody's carrying a weapon. So if everybody's worried, everybody starts carrying a weapon. And then it becomes the perception that it's just normal to carry a weapon. And then what we see is the more weapons that people tend to carry, the more that people will know people who've then not only carrying, but also been attacked as well by a weapon. And so what you tend to get occurring, and this came up time and time again with us in interviews, is you get these cycles of protection. So you get the fear, you acquire a weapon, everybody carries, it's normalized, so you get more carrying, essentially. But linked to this and how these cycles are formed, we found, next slide please, it's very much driven by fear, which then leads to this weapons contagion effect. And I put some quotes here from interviews, but the quote here is from an interview we did in prison where the guy says, I know a certain couple of people who carry it every day. It's like phone, house keys, ammonia. So there's this idea that there's fear here, people are carrying weapons. And so you start to get these contagion effects across certain number of groups. Next slide, please. What we also see as well in relation to sort of fear amplification, we saw across our interviewees, social media clearly influences the carrying of weapons. So many of our interviewees obviously were very active on social media, and here you get lots of stories about corrosive use, about weapons use, which also heightens the idea that people are carrying regularly. And these groups would use what we refer to as simple availability heuristics to calculate risk. So this is not based on hard evidence, okay, your calculation of the need to carry, but it's based on the idea that I know Joe and he carries, and Joe knows Sarah who carries. And so what you're doing is your networks start to provide you information about carrying. And so you start to believe that carrying is very much normalized. So we see this very clear influence of the peer group on weapons contagion. And what this leads to, next slide please, is not only this idea that people need to carry all the time, but we get this idea as well, particularly among certain groups and those who are on the kind of retail ends of drug markets who carry corrosives, that they then start to carry around notions of respect and reputation, which is nothing new. We see this with knife crime. There's social capital, respect and reputation to be gained out of carrying weapons. It fosters a reputation of toughness, street credibility, and also helps to kind of alleviate some of these fears around the need for self-protection. And I put a couple of quotes down here. The interview 2 quote here is very interesting. This was a guy I interviewed in prison. He referred to himself as an older offender. I mean, he was about 24, 25. But he talks about the new generation of offenders who are coming through on the streets. And he talks about this new generation who've got a lot to prove. They've got a lot to prove, and they actually don't mind dying on the streets. They want to very much foster this reputation of toughness and hardness. So there then becomes a question about why do people use corrosives in crime events? And I'll go through these very quickly. Next slide, please, Emily. So we see that corrosives was used in 3 particular types of crime events. So we've got robbery, where corrosives are used to enforce the crime event. We have street violence, where corrosives are quite often used to punish or act as revenge and control against people who maybe are challenging others to street fights, or are maybe questioning the price of drugs or trying to steal drugs. So we get that street violence elements to this. And we also see corrosives used in domestic violence as well. Next slide, please. What we identified, though, is where you have a transition from acid carrier to acid thrower, there have to be certain things which are present here. So you need an offender who's receptive to the possibility of throwing a corrosive in a crime event. They have to be present at a crime event, obviously, to throw. But one of the important things is there has to be sufficient intent to throw acid in the crime event. So you need people who are receptive to the possibility of actually throwing acid, but also there's got to be sufficient intent as well in the crime to throw the acid. And so the desired outcome of the crime is usually aided by the corrosive substance. Okay, and what we identify is that one of the key reasons why people actually throw acid in crime is partly to do to the utility of the substance in that crime event. So just next slide here, please. So we identified that our interviewees told us about a number of reasons why they like to use corrosive in a crime event. And we identified all of these reasons, okay? That what corrosives gives the user in a crime event is it's adaptable, okay? It creates an element of surprise in a crime event. So if you're carrying a corrosive in a water bottle, quite often somebody won't know what this is. And so it's very quick to pull out and very quick to use. You also have a weapon which is ready to use all the time because you can just be carrying it in a bottle. We identified as well that there's a lot of target accuracy with corrosives, because if you're carrying a corrosive in, say, a Lucozade sports bottle, you can squirt that 5, 6, 7 meters and be fairly accurate with that. So a lot of our interviewees talked about how that actually gives them a better option than a knife to use in a street fight. Because obviously with a knife, you have to get close up to somebody, you have to sort of try and stab somebody. A corrosive is actually far better to use in many of those circumstances. So you can maintain that physical distance, it's silent to use. But one of the most important things we found about the use of corrosives is it gives that instant visual incapacitation in crimes. So particularly in robberies, okay, you get close to somebody, you squirt them in the face, the first thing they do is hold their eyes. It visually incapacitates them straight away. So in a robbery and also in a street fight, you've got the advantage over somebody straight away. So there's lots of utility in the use of corrosives in that kind of crime. Next slide, please, Emily. And this is just from an interview, again, with somebody in prison who was talking about why actually he liked to use ammonia. And he was quite a big guy, okay? And he said, in a fight, a knife is not controlled. You tussle, you get wound up, you lose control. Then you stab someone, you can do serious damage to them. Ammonia is better than a knife. I don't want to kill somebody. And he claimed he diluted the substance, so it would only do minor injury. That was another thing which came out of our interviews. The number of people who said they diluted substances, so they claimed it wouldn't do too much damage to their adversaries. But I'm not quite sure about that. I think there might be a bit of kind of social desirability effect there in the interviews. And then finally, I just say a little bit about prevention. So there are lots of potential approaches to prevention around corrosive substance crime. And what we've seen, obviously, with the Offensive Weapons Act is weapons controls. We've seen retailer initiatives as well. We've also seen as well changes in the law to create offences very much based around deterrence. So intent to throw acid obviously now carries a severe sentence with it. I think what the government have done here is very commendable in many ways around the creation of the Offensive Weapons Act. I think they've been shown to try and do something. They're trying to control the supply of corrosive substances. They're trying to get retailers on board with the sale of corrosive substances, and they're also trying to use more severe sentences as a way, as a deterrence effect. However, I'm extremely sceptical about using the law as a way of preventing weapons crime generally. I think controls will work in some circumstances. I'm not entirely convinced it will work in relation to corrosives. I think there are other, probably better approaches we need to be exploring. And I think targeting individuals or at the onset of criminal careers, maybe using public health approaches, are possibly better ways to target populations of weapons users. And I know some great work has been done on Scotland on this already, and some great work has been done on England as well with the violence reduction units in relation to this. And I'm just going to leave you with this because I'm aware I've gone over time. I think one of the key challenges around using the law, particularly in sentencing as a way of dealing with this, is that quite often we found that our sample population didn't really know what the law was in relation to corrosives. And also this final quote here, when I squirted him, nothing of the sort about a possible prison term was going through my head. At that time, it was for me to get away. I wouldn't have cared if there was 100 years in jail. So our interviewees quite often talks about kind of not really knowing what the law was, not really believing they would get caught anyway, and being caught in that moment where you're in a street fight or an incident with your peer group and not really considering what the consequences might be. And I'm going to be quiet because I realise I've gone over time here. So, and I've covered a lot there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt. That was really helpful, really insightful overview. I've just heard that, just checking that everybody can see all the questions or can submit questions if everybody wants to try. I've certainly got lots of questions for you, Matt, but I'll wait until we've heard what Jaff says and in case they're answered by your presentation, Jaff. So I'll hand over to you in just a second. So Jaff has been working in the social justice, human rights and international development sector for nearly 30 years and now leads Acid Survivors Trust International, which are the only international organization whose sole purpose is to end acid violence at a global level. So over to you, Jaff. Oh, just unmute there, Jaff.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. Really pleased to be given this opportunity to expand on the issue of acid violence. As Emily says, I've kind of worked in the human rights sector, and I've worked specifically around acid violence for now, I think 11 years, in fact. So I'm just going to move on quite quickly to talk firstly a little bit about ASTI and the work we've done and the work we're planning to do. So our vision is really to end acid burns violence and ensure survivors live with dignity and without fear. Over the last 11, 12 years, we've had what we would describe as fairly successful impact in that, in partnership with the United Nations and the British government, we've delivered projects in multiple countries that have led to medical, legal support for hundreds of survivors. We've also helped change laws in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Cambodia, and most recently, the UK. And all of those countries that I've just listed, particularly Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Cambodia, have seen very significant drops in acid violence. And that's not purely down to the introduction of specific legislation. I think it's also a lot to do with awareness raising and educating at-risk groups, particularly. And clearly in the UK, really relieved to know that acid attacks have actually dropped quite significantly since they peaked in around 2017, with I think it was about just under 1,000 reported attacks. So I think there's been a drop of probably about a third by 2020, 2021. Looking ahead, what we're planning to do is really work on a number of projects, one of which is about trying to advocate for more robust due diligence on the part of suppliers, corporates who actually produce, sell, distribute acid. And we're also initiating a lot more research, not just in the UK, but also internationally, with a focus around South America and the Caribbean. And finally, we're also looking to introduce, well, pilot a new project focused in London to help prevent acid attacks. As kind of Matt mentioned in his presentation earlier, acid attacks occur globally, and they have occurred globally for many, many, many years. The regions most impacted are South Asia, parts of East Africa and Southern Africa, the Middle East, South America, Latin America, and parts of the Caribbean. All of those regions have fairly high numbers of recorded acid attacks. And unlike the UK, most of those regions experience acid attack where the perpetrator's goal is really to disfigure and maim their intended victims. And most of those victims, at least 75%, tend to be women and girls. So there's a very clear difference in terms of the issue of acid violence occurring globally and what's happening here in the UK. So I think I just kind of dropped this quote in from a publication called the Reformers Gazette, which produced a piece in 1834, where there's a quote that says, "The crime of throwing vitriol, acid, as we grieve to say, becomes so common in this part of the country as to become almost a stain on the national character." Now, that's interesting, clearly on a number of levels, but most significantly, it indicates the scale of the problem as it happened in Glasgow, in Scotland, in the early 1800s. And that issue of acid violence wasn't exclusive to Scotland. It was occurring across the UK since the 1700s in fairly large numbers. So kind of, fast forwarding 200 years almost, what we're seeing, certainly in London over the last, well, from the period 2014 to 2016, was effectively almost a doubling of attacks occurring year on year, to the point where in 2016 in London alone, there were 454 reported attacks. Clearly, if there were attacks that were committed by young men against young men that may have involved gang-related activities, there's question marks about the real number. I think the real number will have been quite higher than 454. And one way potentially of better understanding the real scale of the problem is also checking hospital records, not relying solely on data provided by, in this case, the Met Police. I'm sorry, let's go back. So kind of focusing in on the rates of attacks as they occurred in London, it was quite evident looking at police data through Freedom of Information requests that the focus of attacks were occurring basically in three main boroughs: Newham, Tower Hamlets, Barking and Dagenham, three neighbouring boroughs. So it certainly appears to be that kind of contagion type impact from one borough to another. Thankfully, the numbers have dropped since 2016, but they still remain pretty high. We don't have full data on the number of attacks in those three boroughs, partly because we're not being able to get that data from the various police forces. A lot of the police forces have a very limited budget when it comes to responding to freedom of information requests. So you have to quite often submit kind of baseline question of how many attacks occurred, as opposed to being able to ask about the demographics of victims and perpetrators, age, ethnicity, etc. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done to really kind of get to understand the problem and the groups most impacted in terms of age, demographics and ethnicity. So this is data for 2020 that we've compiled with a percentage breakdown of how regions are impacted by acid violence in 2020. You can see that Manchester constitutes 41% of corrosive assaults, and that's a major change because previously, for a number of years, London certainly constituted the single largest proportion of attacks. So we've got the West Midlands with almost 10%, which is pretty high. And this excludes data from Police Scotland. So the total UK figures will be probably closer to 800, I would just 850 maybe. So the issue of acid attacks hasn't gone away. And like Matt, I'm certainly of the view that the issue may come back at a higher rate because of its cyclical nature and the potential cost of living crisis. The issues around poverty and deprivation certainly are, in my view, a major contributory factor, because when we look at the data, you rarely see acid attacks occurring in affluent neighborhoods or boroughs. They always tend to be in the neighborhoods, areas, districts or boroughs that have high levels of deprivation. So I think there's certainly, in my view, a strong correlation there. So just wanted to have a quick opportunity to talk about corrosive crimes in Scotland in 2018-19. So this, again, is based on the FOI we submitted to Police Scotland. And you can see a total number of 99 offences. I think it's important to point out that under common assault, we've got 91. That doesn't necessarily specifically refer to actual acts of physical violence. Common assault can also include the threat of violence, someone threatening to attack someone with acid. So again, we really kind of need to really drill down into those numbers to get a better understanding of how many of those actually led to a physical assault. In terms of moving forward and the work we've done around acid violence prevention, we, as I kind of mentioned briefly a bit earlier, we'd help to advocate for change in law around the Offensive Weapons Act, and we were consulted by the Home Office. And we first became aware of gaps in legislative provisions back in 2014, because we'd actually commissioned research, piece of research called Justice, What Justice? And that identified that there were a number of issues with existing legislation at the time. One of which was there was no age restriction around the purchasing of corrosives, even at a high concentration levels. And it's very possible that a number of young perpetrators who were potentially already engaged in violent attacks using other weapons, identified that that being caught with acid in terms of possession of acid wouldn't lead to any kind of charge. So there was, big gaps there in existing legislation prior to the Offensive Weapons Act 2019. In terms of our strategy, what we did was really try to engage with multiple stakeholders in order to share the message and our understanding about why young people were resorting to the use of acid. And we kind of utilized the data in our report to advocate for intervention at a governmental level to change the law, to introduce far stricter and control measures to prevent such easy access of acid. We also obviously engaged with a lot of survivor advocates who played a critical role in terms of sharing their stories to the wider British public through media interviews and quotes. And that, I think, really indicated and certainly highlighted the dangerous and almost horrific impact acid attacks have on their intended victims. And as part of understanding the decision-making process that policymakers go through in order to make decisions around introduction of new policies, economics, the financial impact of the introduction of any new legislation is a key factor. So we'd commissioned an economic impact report on the cost of acid attacks in the UK. And at a very, very conservative aspect, and the economists who worked on this project were at pains to introduce a conservative estimate. So we wouldn't be seen to be sensationalizing the cost of acid attacks. That it was £63,000 per attack. Now, bearing in mind, there were around just under 1,000 attacks in 2017. The cost in 1 year alone was 60 million. So I think understanding the cost impact for governments helps to bring about a new way of thinking about, well, okay, there's a clear moral intervention to, a moral case to be made for intervention, but there's also an economic case for intervention. And we kind of estimated that if those kind of numbers continued or even slightly dropped, then the cost of acid attack over a 5-year period would be about £350 million. So that's an enormous financial cost. And by reducing acid attacks, we're also helping to reduce the suffering and the pain and survivors experience, but we're also preventing incredibly high costs being spent providing treatment, spent on criminal justice system, policing, etc. So that's one of the key areas we've worked around in advocacy to help bring about a change in UK law. So the specifics, the particular provisions the government introduced through the Offensive Weapons Act specific to corrosives was this preventing the sale of corrosive products to anyone under the age of 18. Now that was critical because from the initial data we got from the Met Police back in, I think, 2016, 2017, the single largest group of perpetrators in London were under the age of 20, 21. I think almost a third of attacks, if I remember correctly, were committed by predominantly young men under the age of 20. The second kind of key provision was prohibiting the delivery of corrosive products to residential premises. and clearly making it a criminal offence to possess a corrosive substance in a public place. It may seem very obvious, but none of these provisions existed up until 2019. And obviously there was an introduction of minimum custodial sentences for those convicted of multiple subsequent possession of corrosives. In terms of our work, trying to prevent acid attacks occurring and recognizing the issue of acid attacks occurring specifically in areas in East London, we've recently kind of pulled together a project, bringing in partners such as Town Hamlets and Newham Council, Metropolitan Police, National Police Chiefs Council, and we have Matt and his team at the University of Leicester working on the independent evaluation of the pilot. And what we're looking to do is deploy the tool of a digital graphic novel to tell the story of an acid attack survivor and a perpetrator, with the aim to really highlight the consequences of an acid attack on both the survivor and the perpetrator. And clearly, in the case of the survivor, it's really about highlighting the enormous kind of physical, psychological harm that an acid attack results in, and to recover, the incredibly lengthy, painful recovery process for many survivors. And in terms of the perpetrator, it's really about, trying to understand and highlighting the social circumstances in which an acid attack might be committed, but then to also understand the consequences for the perpetrator if they're caught and sentenced to imprisonment, the impact that would have on them, but also on their immediate family, community, and others who are directly implicated by the attack. And it's, we recognize that many young people who may be at risk in the at-risk groups are also victims of trauma themselves. We want to really kind of bring up the issue of trauma for both victims of, obviously, of attack, but also perpetrators. We think this project, has the potential to be scaled, partly because by producing a downloadable digital graphic novel, it can be shared at no cost. And I think it provides a medium that may just help reach a young audience. And there's more and more evidence that graphic novels, comics are almost very kind of therapeutic type mediums in which to engage with fairly difficult, challenging subject matter, such as acid violence. So just kind of, going back to the point about perpetrators also suffering from trauma and also understanding the risk factors for at-risk groups. And, this is a paper based on presented by the World Health Organization, which provides an ecological breakdown of the different factors at an individual relationship, community, and societal level that may bring about, create a higher risk factor for violence. And I think when you look at those risk factors, it's evident that certain boroughs with high levels of deprivation will be impacted by a number of those risk factors. So what we're proposing with our project in isolation won't bring about an enormous drop in acid attacks. What it needs is a wider intervention on the part of government to address the wider kind of societal issues around deprivation, educational attainment levels, and issues around support for young people who've experienced trauma. You know, there's so many different aspects to identifying and addressing those risk factors. So this project in isolation won't do that. It has to happen as part of a wider initiative to understand the deeper kind of societal issues. And that's my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Jeff. That was really interesting, and I'm particularly as you touched on the trauma at the end, because that was some of my questions actually. So I think we do have some questions now coming through. I'll go through these ones first, and if anybody else is having trouble, you can pop your hand, raise your hand, your Zoom hand, and we can come to you. One of the questions is from the audience, sorry. We're currently experiencing a rise in youth offending and territorial or young team violence in the community I work in, with a number of young people carrying weapons aged 12 to 16. I can easily see some of these young men opting to use corrosives if the idea was to come to them for all the reasons discussed. How can we work directly with young people who are already carrying and offending to prevent them from moving on to corrosive violence? So I wonder, Matt and Jeff, if there was anybody or any people that kind of fit that similar profile within your interviewees, or Jeff, anybody again similar to that you've worked with in your projects?
Well, I think from my perspective, the whole point of this project I've just mentioned, the graphic novel project, is really about not actually engaging with young people. It's really about working in partnerships with individuals and groups who have direct contact with at-risk people. So in our case, it's about producing the tools, in this case, the graphic novel and the toolkit to go with it, and working with local community safety teams in those boroughs in which we wish to pilot the project, and with the local police, etc., and the various other groups who are engaging with young people, to just kind of try to introduce the subject and highlight, as I said, the consequences for both victim and perpetrator of an acid attack. And the point of using a graphic novel is really about trying to engage with young people with a visual medium, and to tell a story in narrative form, which we hope is a more effective way of engaging and tackling a very serious subject matter.
I mean, I echo a lot of what Jeff has said there. I think providing information on possible consequences and outcomes of really engaging in bad events is really important. But I also think as well, you know, we're getting to understand and to know much more now about weapons possession and maybe what works with people who, I mean, I often think, you know, is weapons possession the issue here, or is it dealing with issues which actually lead to weapons possession? You know, what I think we need to be careful here of just kind of boxing off weapons crime in one box, thinking, right, we've got to deal with that. I think the issue is, you know, we're dealing with people who are motivated quite often to engage in low-level criminality, and weapons become part of the tools of the trade here. And I think if we look at a lot of the work which, you know, the violence reduction units have been doing across England, you know, I think there's some really good evaluation work now which is being published by the Youth Endowment Fund around, you know, kind of what's starting to look promising, what's starting to work in relation to dealing with young people. And I think one of the things which came out of our research, which I often quote or talk about with people, is that when we sat in prisons talking to people, the same life stories came out time and time again. Dropping out of school or being kicked out of school, at 12, 13, 14. The next stop is the street. The next stop is selling drugs or engaging in kind of street violence, weapons carrying, and then obviously, you end up in the criminal justice system. I think we need to find ways of stopping those life stories continuing to emerge. And I know this is the $1 million question, and people are going to be sitting there thinking, well, how do we do this? But I think, we have to know our communities. We have to engage with our communities. We have to know, what's happening in our communities. We have to engage with the right groups of people, and we have to try and tackle, social exclusion, school exclusion. I think those are kind of two of the most really important things. I mean, as an immediate quick win, I think tackling school exclusions is really important here, because when people start to lose that structure, they're not going to school anymore. I think you've got a big problem.
That actually follows on that. I was going to ask you about, in the interviews, was there any other kind of protective factors? You talked about, obviously, about lives, marked by poverty, and Jeff was talking about trauma. And I assume that was fairly similar across your interviewees, but I wondered if they kind of also talked about anything that could have helped them that they didn't have, or that they kind of pointed to, or like you said, the school exclusion was maybe a commonality among that group.
School exclusion, family breakdown. I mean, you listen to, there's a guy called Sheldon Thomas, Gangs Line, and he talks a lot about family breakdown and how that influences gangs in South London. And so, we almost get, with our interviews, we almost got a full gambit, like the full set of risk factors, coming from areas of severe deprivation, which were underfunded, high school dropout rates, broken families. And I'm not saying that's the answer to everything, but with a lot of people, it's almost having somebody who could kind of guide them and take them under their wings and identify at an early stage, what was happening and where they were going to end up if somebody wasn't able to provide that guidance. And I think a lot of the work of the violence reduction units now is about identifying where the onset populations are and trying to work with them, whether that's in schools or providing mentoring services. And trying to give more of that sort of early support to young people.
Yeah, it certainly sounds a lot like youth work for all the youth workers that are here, and certainly
which is underfunded. This is providing the resources to do this properly is a real key thing.
I was certainly struck, Jeff, if you're saying about the 60 million, I'm sure you could afford a lot of youth work provision for 60 million pounds for sure. Somebody has popped in, not a question per se, but an observation, saying that acid crime or labeling as such may diminish that this is a serious violent crime, grievous bodily harm or attempted murder, and that the new sections in the Offensive Weapons Act make possession it's closing a loophole, but carrying substances in a disguised water bottle, for example, that bottle is then in itself an adapted offensive weapon. So I suppose harsher legal aspects. Another one of my questions was about.
Sorry, Emily, and a key issue here is about being able to identify the substance as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, to identify that substance, you need testing kits to do that, which testing kits tend to be very expensive. So that is an issue as well that I know that the Corrosive Substance Working Group have been working on. So it's okay having the offence of possession, but you've got to be able to identify what the substance is as well.
Another thing that was touched on in my last question, certainly, if there's any more questions from the audience, please do add them in, was about social norms. So that, you were both kind of saying about, you then make yourself a network that everybody carries weapons or corrosive substances. It seems very normal. You carry it then for protection because everybody else is carrying it. Was there anything, again, in either of your work that was kind of a sign of breaking that social norm? That how do people get out of that vicious cycle of that being the usual thing? House keys, phone, ammonia was quite a striking quote. yeah, how are people getting out of that norm?
Jeff, do you want, I mean, for our group, unfortunately, the way they got out of that norm was by entry into the criminal justice system. And I spoke to people who didn't want to go back to the communities they'd come from, because they knew as soon as they go back, it would be hard for them to break that cycle again. They'd become involved with the same peer groups, and they would just generally drift into criminality again. Of course, there are other ways to break that cycle through earlier intervention, the youth work that we spoke about. But I often think about our cohort for the interviews, and I often, as a researcher, look back on that cohort and think of all the wasted opportunities and the wasted kind of talent. I mean, hopefully a lot of those people will go on to do wonderful things in the future. But it's a shame that they have to break that cycle by entry into the criminal justice system. I don't know if that answers your question at all, Emily. But
so, Matt, I just kind of expand on that point. I spoke to a criminal barrister a while back, and she was representing a client, and she said to me that one of the things her client had said was that he just didn't understand the consequences. He hadn't thought through the consequences of his actions, basically. And I think, and I kind of go back to the graphic novel, because that is the point of the graphic novel, is to kind of educate and let young people know who are at risk, that look, there are really serious consequences, and those negative impacts that result from an acid attack will impact on you, your immediate family, through incarceration, whatever sentence that is, and the lifelong impact, the life-changing impact of that will be very significant. And it's really about, we want to, through the graphic novel, to be educated around the provisions, what the implications are legally, just at a very basic level. Say, well, look, if you caught carrying a corrosive substance, then you could face imprisonment, custodial sentences. So it's because there is that level of lack of understanding, I think, for clearly from a number of young people who are not really understanding the severity of their actions, and the impact it has not just on the survivor, but that will have on them and their immediate family.
Yeah, and a lot of our work's around that education aspect too. One more question from the audience is, how common is reoffending?
I have no data on that at all, so I can't answer that question, sorry.
It's okay.
I mean, we just don't know. That's a straight answer to this. I mean, we know obviously what recidivism rates are when people come out of prison, and obviously they're not good. But in terms of how often people will actually use weapons in violent offences, I mean, we just don't know.
Okay. I'm going to finish sharing some of our work, if you just give me a second here. So again, to wrap up, thinking of prevention. And if we look at a specifically no knives approach, we take a youth work approach to our work, which means that young people choose to participate. That's voluntary participation. We start from where young people are at, and young people and youth workers are equal partners in the process, which is really important. We're also taking an evidence-based approach, part of having Matt and Jeff here this morning to learn a bit more about this issue, and also rights-based, children's rights-based in particular. And it might seem a little bit awkward shoehorning this in, or especially if you don't work with rights very often, but I feel it's good to remind ourselves of the specifics of children's rights, both of those children harmed by corrosive substance violence and those who are responsible for corrosive substance violence. So beyond obviously the general principles that children shouldn't be discriminated against, we should have their best interests as a primary consideration, that children have the right to survival and development, and that they have the rights to have their views heard and taken seriously. We know that children have a right to protection from violence, abuse and neglect, that if they are arrested, detained or imprisoned, it should only be as a last resort and for as little time as possible. That those who have experienced negative things happening to them, that they have the right to support to recover, and whatever support that might be, and that any children accused or guilty of breaking the law should be treated with dignity and respect. So I think just laying those out at the start of how we think about prevention in this aspect. So for those listening who want hard resources in their hands, we already have a couple of No Knives resources that, although their original message was intended to be about knives or other weapons like that, the messaging and discussion points work for corrosive substances as well. So we have our brief intervention cards, which are really for youth workers on the go that can be used kind of without having a session plan. They're kind of in the moment resources. When something occurs within the situation that you're working in, you can really start these discussions as a talking point. And we also have our Nay Danger Guide, which is about being an active bystander. So this is specifically for young people themselves, supporting their peer groups and speaking up and taking action when they know that something's happening. We also have brand new training available on our website about taking a restorative approach in your youth work. And this is definitely touching on a lot of things that were mentioned here about recognizing the trauma and challenging circumstances that people responsible for harm have often experienced, and their vulnerability, as well as looking at how we can repair the harm that's been done. So this is just a slide taken from some of that training. So if we think here of the harm as being an incident of corrosive substance violence, you know, who needs to be involved in repairing that harm? It's as well the person who has been harmed, as well as the person responsible and that wider community. So I know Jaff was talking about their work being contagious amongst communities. And if we're talking about communities as having a real role in repairing that harm, so it doesn't become contagious. So those are just some of the options that we have already on our website that are available right now for practitioners. I want to say a special thank you to Matt and Jaff for taking the time this morning to speak with all of us. I found that really fascinating. Certainly lots more for us to learn here in Scotland, certainly because we don't have a lot of data at the moment, though hopefully that's going to change soon. Everybody who's attending will get through slides, all of the slides that we've had today, and the recording will be available hopefully next week sometime. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending this webinar. Thank you, Matt and Jaff, for taking your time out this morning.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Bye.